There are places where science ends and darkness begins, where reality fractures and nightmares breathe. These are the tales of Carl Otto's dark anthology, The Djinn Particle by Carl Otto. The archives tell the true story. That's why Ibrahim keeps them sealed. The wall before them continued to ripple, like fabric in a breeze. Through its shifting surface, they could make out shelves of books and scrolls, glass cases containing strange objects, and walls covered in writing that seemed to glow with its own light. "Remember," Hamid said as they prepared to step through, "don't look too long at any one shadow, and if you hear voices that don't belong to us," he swallowed hard, "don't answer them, no matter what they promise." Nazari took a deep breath, feeling the air grow thicker as they approached the rippling surface. The wall's substance seemed to part like heavy curtains of water, its touch cold against his skin. For a moment, reality twisted around them. Up became sideways, forward became down, and time itself seemed to hold its breath. Then they were inside. The archives stretched impossibly far in every direction, shelves reaching up into darkness, corridors extending beyond what the temple's exterior dimensions should allow. Ancient texts and artifacts filled glass cases, their surfaces occasionally shifting like mirages. "The restricted section is ahead," Elder Mahmud whispered, removing the iridescent key from his robe, "where Ibrahim keeps the most dangerous knowledge." A sudden wave of vertigo hit Nazari. The air felt thicker here, charged with potential. That familiar heatwave distortion appeared at the edge of his vision, more defined than ever before. "It's stronger here," Hamid whispered, his small hand finding Nazari's. "Can you feel it?" Nazari nodded, unable to speak. While the others examined the artifacts, he watched the heat distortion take shape, more substantial than he'd ever seen it. No one else seemed to notice as it moved closer, studying him with ancient eyes that burned through time itself. "There," Amir pointed to a section of wall different from the others. Unlike the flowing stone around it, this surface was perfectly still, a rectangle of absolute stillness in the midst of fluid reality. Symbols carved into its frame pulsed with a light that seemed to draw power from the shadows themselves. The heat distortion shifted closer to Nazari, its presence both terrifying and familiar. Though the others continued their examination of the wall, he clearly saw it raise what might have been a hand, pointing first to him, then to the door, then to itself. "The door to its prison," Hamid's voice shook slightly, "and its home." The boy's sensor smoke swirled toward the door, forming patterns that matched the glyphs in Nazari's notebook. But these symbols moved with purpose, as if reading them might unlock more than just their meaning. Nazari stepped forward, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't explain. The heat distortion moved with him, and though the others remained focused on the door, he felt its ancient attention fixed solely on him. "Now you understand," Hamid said softly, "why Ibrahim keeps it sealed." He looked up at Nazari with those eyes that held both childhood and ancient wisdom. "Are you sure you want to open it?" Behind them, shadows moved against the sensor's light, forming shapes that suggested watchers from other times. The door waited, perfectly still in its frame of flowing stone, while the heat distortion rippled with patient, eternal attention that only Nazari could see. The choice hung in the air like smoke from Hamid's sensor, to open the door and confront whatever truth waited behind it, or to walk away and leave the mystery sealed in its ancient prison. But looking at the distortion that seemed to exist between states of reality, its form both void and being, Nazari knew there was really no choice at all. His hand reached for the door. Hamid stopped abruptly at the threshold, his sensor smoke refusing to enter the room. "I can't," he said, clutching the sensor tighter. "The salt, it remembers too much. And the walls." He touched the doorframe, then quickly pulled his hand back. They're hungry. The room stretched before them, impossibly precise in its construction. The ceiling hung low enough that Nazari had to slightly duck his head. Rock salt crunched under their feet as they entered, the sound unnaturally sharp in the dead air. Remarkable craftsmanship, Elder Mahmoud whispered, running his hand along the silver inlay that traced geometric patterns across the smooth walls. These symbols, they're older than any I've seen in the archives. Amir pulled out his EMF meter, its familiar electronic whine dying the moment it crossed the threshold. He shook it, checked the batteries. Nothing. That's impossible. I just calibrated it. Nazari unshouldered his own equipment bag, setting up his more sophisticated instruments. Each failed in turn, digital displays going dark, mechanical needles spinning wildly before freezing. His phone flashed an absurd timestamp, then died entirely. The room itself is containing it, he muttered, more fascinated than frustrated. Like a Faraday cage, but for... He trailed off, realizing there was no scientific terminology for what they were experiencing. Their footsteps carried them deeper into the room. The salt bed was deep enough that their feet sank slightly with each step, leaving pristine tracks behind them. The air felt processed, as if each molecule had been individually filtered and approved. About halfway down the room's length, Elder Mahmoud and Amir stopped almost simultaneously. There was no visible barrier, no obvious reason, but something in their hindbrain recognized a line that shouldn't be crossed. Nazari, Amir called softly. I think we should. But Nazari was already moving forward, drawn by the stone altar at the room's end. An urn sat upon it, not ornate, but undeniably ancient. Its partially crystallized surface caught the light. Step away from the altar, Ibrahim commanded as he suddenly appeared at the doorway. His voice carried authority, but his feet remained planted firmly at the threshold. You know what this is, don't you? Nazari gestured to his dead instruments. The containment field, the suppression methods. They're not just religious artifacts. They're technology. Technology. Ibrahim's laugh held no humor, but there was fear beneath his mockery. You still see only what your limited science can grasp. That urn harbors a force your mind cannot understand. The words were proud, but his feet remained planted firmly at the threshold, not out of wisdom, but from primal terror of what he'd spent years pretending to control. Nazari took another step toward the altar. The Djinn and the anomaly are the same thing. Your ancestors didn't trap a supernatural entity. They contained a quantum anomaly that can affect reality itself. Enough! Ibrahim's voice cracked like thunder, but still he wouldn't enter. You have no idea what you're meddling with. Something that could revolutionize our understanding of physics, of reality itself. Nazari reached toward the vessel. This could change everything. The gunshot was deafening in the confined space. Nazari felt the impact high in his chest, spinning him backward. His hand caught the urn as he fell, dragging it with him. The world slowed to a crawl as the ancient container tumbled through the air. It struck the salt-covered floor with a sound like breaking time. The lid skittered away as a softball-sized cluster of fiery light, like heat waves given mass, spilled out. It hung in the air for a fraction of a second before dropping onto Nazari's chest, where the bullet had struck. Nazari's consciousness shattered into infinite points of awareness. He was the bullet entering his chest. He was the vessel falling. He was the heat distortion touching his wound. He was the salt beneath him. He was the air. He was time itself, all simultaneously, all eternally. Past and future collapsed into a single infinite moment. He watched himself being born while dying, while transforming, while existing across centuries. His scientific mind tried to grasp what was happening, even as it unraveled like wet paper in acid. I am watching myself watch myself, become myself, become myself, become. The equation is solving me. I am solving the equation, I am the equation. Time is a lie we tell ourselves to avoid seeing the truth. He saw his own imprisonment eons ago, saw himself design the vessel that would contain him, saw himself guide its creation through dreams and whispers across generations. He was the Djinn teaching humans to trap the Djinn so that he could become the Djinn. The paradox spiraled through his dissolving sanity like a fractal of madness, each iteration spawning new impossibilities that were simultaneously true. His human consciousness stretched past breaking point, collapsed into thoughts that burned through reality's thin veneer. The universe wasn't particles and waves and forces. It was information screaming to be understood, probability nightmares waiting to be born, potential horrors crouching at the edge of comprehension. I have always been here. I will always be becoming. The observer is the observed is the observation. Time is a circle drawn in non-Euclidean space. The bullet wound became a singularity of possibility, where consciousness merged across all timelines. He felt himself scatter across dimensions, each version simultaneously true, each understanding bleeding into the others, until individual identity became another lie, exposed by infinite awareness. Through infinite awareness he perceived, caused, remembered his own path to this moment. In the Land Rover, he watched himself experience that wave of déjà vu, because he was there, whispering across time, preparing his human self for what would come. He was the strange certainty about Amir's grandfather and the cave, planting seeds of understanding that would bloom into comprehension. The dream that wasn't a dream. He had reached across time to show himself Ibrahim's meeting room, to write equations in his own notebook that his human mind couldn't yet understand. I am teaching myself what I learned from myself teaching myself. The crystalline watch that had so fascinated his scientific mind, he had transformed it, would transform it, was always transforming it. The metal changed because he needed his human self to see proof of what was possible, needed to draw himself toward this eternal moment of becoming. Those heat distortions that only he could see, himself watching himself, preparing himself, guiding himself toward this point, where observer and observed collapsed into one eternal entity. Every glimpse had been a moment of self-recognition across time, reality bending around the paradox of his existence. Through the crystallizing remnants of his humanity, he dimly perceived the others' reactions, their last moments of comprehension before what he had become burned them away. Amir stumbled backward, his scientific instruments forgotten, as reality rippled around what had been Nazari. His final thought was a formula, an equation that explained everything. And then his mind ignited, body crumbling to ash that hung suspended in air that had forgotten gravity. Elder Mahmud fell to his knees, ancient prayers turning to screams as his flesh crystallized and shattered, the silver inlay in the walls pulsing in sympathy as patterns that had been designed by him will be designed by him, is being designed by him, etched themselves into reality. Ibrahim's terror tasted like copper and ozone, his gun falling from nerveless fingers as he finally understood what his ancestors had bound here. His understanding came too late. His body blazed like a magnesium flare, reduced to fine white powder on the salt-covered floor. Even young Hamid, watching from the threshold, had just enough time to whisper, "I understand now," before his form dispersed like smoke from his own censer, his essence joining the eternal dance of what Nazari had become. The circle closed. The experiment concluded. The observation completed itself, and reality screamed. The thing that had been Nazari hung in the air, a mass of smokeless fire, like a tear into a dimension flame and power. Around it, the room was a perfect circle of ash and crystallized air, The walls scorched with glowing, searing hot symbols. The salt on the floor had become a lattice of cracked reality. I am what I have always been. I am what I will become. The experiment and the experimenter are one. Time is a circle, and I am its circumference and everything within. The observation must continue. The circle must grow. The temple itself began to transform, the primordial rock morphing into luminous mineral that resonated with otherworldly melodies. The transformation spread outward, a wave of reality-altering energy that reshaped everything it touched before it closed in on itself, smaller and smaller until it vanished. The village below would find only an empty crater, smooth as glass, where the temple had stood, those who survived to find anything at all. Some would say they heard laughter in the wind that night, not human laughter, but the sound of reality being rewritten by something eternal. The Djinn was no longer bound by anything as simple as reality. Time was a circle, and it was both circumference and everything within. It had places to be, moments to visit, a timeline to maintain, and perhaps in moments of cosmic boredom, new experiments to conduct, new observers to transform, new patterns to write across the fabric of existence. After all, somewhere in the past, a young scientist named Nazari was about to begin studying quantum anomalies, and he would need guidance to become what he had always been. The circle would grow, and eventually all of existence would become part of its whole.